So today's speaker is Matt Hershberger. Matt is a writer, blogger, and humorist right here in Red Bank, New Jersey. He writes about travel, politics, culture, and humor. Matt has a BA in journalism from Penn State and a Master of Science in political science from the London School of Economics, where he wrote his dissertation on the U.S. conservative media's coverage of children of undocumented immigrants and the impact that coverage has on our government's policy. He is managing editor at Matador Network and has been published in Business Insider, The Daily Mail, on Fox News, Thought Catalog, The Migrationists, and Immigration Impact. He's worked as the website and blog manager for the pro-immigrant group American Immigration Council in Washington, D.C. And that was during the push for immigration reform back in 2013. He currently has a blog about the intersection of travel, culture, and politics called Fellow Travelers. And his main interest, which is so aligned with ours, is how to live well in the 21st century. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Matt Hershberger.
All right, is that on? There we go. Excuse me. So thank you for all having me. This is a really cool experience for me. I've been a secular humanist since I was 15 years old. That was around when I stopped believing in God. I left the Catholic Church, and some benevolent non-believer put Kurt Vonnegut into my hands, Slaughterhouse-Five. So I was able to replace religion pretty seamlessly with secular humanism. I was kind of casting about for any atheist thinker at that point, and so I know perfectly well that as a privileged straight white guy from the Midwest, there was just as good of a chance that someone would have put Ayn Rand into my hands, and that would have set me on the path to being a pompous, selfish jackass. So, so I'm really thankful for communities like this one, which I feel push young, impressionable atheists towards a life of compassion and kindness, when it would be so easy for kids like us to turn into little armies of Paul Ryans. So my humanism is dictated in large part the course of my life. When I graduated college with a journalism degree in 2009, I found that there were literally no jobs out there. Every newspaper in the country was either shutting down or was cutting staff. So I had to make a choice of a new career, and I decided to study human rights at the London School of Economics. As a humanist, human rights seemed really like the best way that I could spend my life fighting for that. As a concept, it grew out of the Enlightenment, which is the same movement that humanism can trace its modern roots to. And organizations like the American Humanists Association are regularly putting out press releases supporting human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is what we have a picture of right here with Eleanor Roosevelt. So I thought I couldn't really go wrong in making this my life's work. But like any honest field of academic study, the first thing they do is they tear down everything you think you know about it. And this is the only honest way to engage with any subject, but it's really annoying when you just plunk down tens of thousands of dollars for a graduate degree. So as a result of the studies, though, I came to realize that while humanists basically support all of the right things, we maybe aren't totally aware of the complicated moral philosophy that we're descended from. The rise of new atheist thinkers like Sam Harris, who in particular has really pushed this idea of morality being able to be descended from these kind of just scientific rational thought, as well as Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, has led me to think that in a kind of rigid acceptance of the Enlightenment's ideas about morality, some secularists have kind of become to resemble in their thinking the religions that they have rejected. It might be that this is the time that we have to examine our ethics and our morality a little bit closer in order to make sure that we're living up to humanist ideals. So through the lens of human rights is a really excellent way to do this. So for this speech, I'd like to spend some time explaining the history of human rights and some of the problems that it's going to face in the 21st century and what we as humanists may be able to do about it. So, human rights have their modern roots, as I said, in the Enlightenment, and they are specifically tied with the political philosophy of liberalism. This is not what you're hearing Sean Hannity or Alex Jones shout about. Liberalism is actually what they say that they're for. It's a style of government that puts a heavy emphasis on the values of liberty and equality. It's gotten really popular over the past several centuries. The USA, India, and pretty much all of Europe are liberal democracies. These are the liberal democracies in the world are the green ones. Yellow are ones that Freedom House, which is it's a liberal think tank, says are mostly free, and then the purple ones are not. But it looked very different several centuries ago. It pretty much would have been all purple. So it grew out of the absolute monarchies of Europe in the 17th century. So for a really long time, absolutists didn't have to justify their form of government. They just said that a king or queen ruled because of something called divine right, which is a fancy way of saying because God said so. But eventually, a real philosopher took a crack at justifying absolutism, and that was Thomas Hobbes. He said that we choose to live in autocratic societies because it's the rational thing to do. He said that life outside civilized society was nasty, brutish, and short. So mankind, being rational, would choose to sacrifice the freedoms of life and nature so as to live a long, happy, civilized life under a supposedly benevolent totalitarian ruler. Freedom for Hobbes wasn't worth it. So this concept became known as the social contract, and the liberals hated it, Hobbes' conclusion, but they really loved the way that he came to it. And so they kind of adopted the social contract. They said that totally sacrificing your freedoms wasn't necessary, and that if you want to escape the state of nature, and that instead you should only sacrifice some of your freedoms, and that certain freedoms should be protected by the government at all costs. These freedoms, they said, were natural rights, just the predecessor to human rights. And this is to say that they were granted not to men by rulers, but by God, and that God has a higher moral authority than any ruler. So a liberal society would have certain freedoms that a government could never ever touch. So I should pause right here and make 3 quick side notes. So first is to mention that all forms of government need to derive their authority from somewhere. And when you're doing this, it's really useful and very easy to say, because God said so. You'll notice that both the absolutists and the liberals use this excuse. And we shouldn't be too hard on liberals here because all forms of government claim to derive their authority from some entity that always ends up being semi-fictional in some way. For fascists, it's the nation. For communists, it's the people. The only group that doesn't have a fictional entity that they claim authority from is the anarchists, and that's because they reject the idea of authority altogether. But it's worth noting for our sakes that the liberals chose the because God said so route. The second point is a bit of a continuation from the first. We should point out that natural rights, which are a precursor of human rights, were almost always justified using the words God-given or endowed by our Creator, or some sort of language like that. So you might be able to see where I'm going, where this could be a problem in the future for non-believers. And the third point is that the social contract is just a thought experiment. It's a really useful thought experiment if you're trying to construct a government that emphasizes freedom and equality, but it is basically fictional. What we know now in the 21st century, which they didn't know when they were first formulating this thought experiment, was that humans don't choose to be part of societies because they're rational creatures making calculated choices, but because we actually evolved as social animals. And the state of nature for us wasn't one of just this lonely, rugged individualism, but was actually part of these small communities and tribes. So that state of nature had its perils, its dangers, its deficiencies, and all of that, but it was never really the meat grinder of brutality that Hobbes and the social contractarians imagined. So if anything, if you want to have a sense of what it looked like, you can look to like chimps and bonobos in the wild now. If you go up to Jane Goodall and you ask, is there any point where you've got a single chimp standing outside the group saying, what's in this for me? Then she's going to say that that's absolutely ridiculous. The founders of liberalism existed before Darwin, and so this wouldn't have occurred to them to think about it in any way. So we'll circle back to these problems, and we'll add a few more to the list, but now it's worth pointing out that liberalism, in spite of its flaws, has, on the whole, been a very successful form of government. It has grown in popularity over the past several centuries, and it usually makes for a pretty pleasant society for most of the people who live in it. So, natural rights, which were so central to liberal thoughts, are only negotiated between the people and their government. So, once you leave that country, those rights effectively no longer apply. This is because internationally for centuries, the most important central concept on the international level has not been natural rights, but national sovereignty. This means that countries have the right to behave as they want without outside interference. So with national sovereignty, it's all well and good to say that the US or the UK gives tons of freedom to its citizens, but they aren't allowed to say boo if the country next door doesn't do anything of the sort. So natural rights at this point in history aren't universal, they're only local. This changes after the World Wars. It became clear in the wake of the Holocaust and the atrocities of the wars that there needed to be some sort of global mechanism for protecting people from their governments, even if you were from the outside. And because most of the countries that were calling the shots were liberal countries, the mechanism that they chose was the language of human rights. So it's here at the end of World War II that the idea of universal human rights takes center stage. It's here that the United Nations is formed, and it's here that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is written. So, the idea of the UN was that it would be a stronger force than its predecessor. The League of Nations, which had been hobbled from the start because basically all the countries had refused to give up any of their national sovereignty, most specifically the United States, which had pushed the League of Nations really hard, and then the Congress didn't ratify it because they didn't want to lose any of their power. So in order for the UN to be stronger, all of these countries basically had to agree to sacrifice some degree of national sovereignty for the greater good. And to their credit, most of the countries in the world actually did so. But the UN's Achilles heel from the start was the Security Council. The Security Council gave the 5 winners of World War II veto power over basically everything that happened. So the UN could only really enforce global human rights if they got the US, France, Britain, the USSR, and China to agree on everything, and this virtually never happened. So with that said though, the UN was able to do a lot of things, and among them were they got 2 major international human rights treaties passed. And these 2 treaties have undoubtedly protected a huge number of people over the past several decades. The first of these treaties makes a lot of sense to us as Americans. It's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and it resembles our Bill of Rights. It includes the right to life, the right to free speech, the right to freedom of the press, the right to freedom of religion, the right to due process, and all of that. As of today, this treaty has been adopted by every country in the world except China, Burma, Saudi Arabia, and a handful of others. So once China actually adopted it, but never officially ratified it, North Korea tried to pull out of it, and then the gray ones just never tried, and Cuba also never ratified it. So it's here that we should pause to point out another inherent weakness of human rights as an idea. If you remember from civics, the first line of the Declaration of Independence is, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed with their Creator by certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Weirdly, the truths that were so self-evident to this group made up of entirely rich white men turned out to be truths that were disproportionately beneficial to rich white men. Setting aside the fact that the Founding Fathers literally just meant men when they said all men are created equal, and in that case they didn't extend the label of man to African slaves, to Native Americans, or in some states, poor whites, the Bill of Rights is a pretty solid foundational document. Most of us agree that freedom of speech, separation of church and state, and due process is a good thing. But you'll notice something about these rights, and that's that they all put limits on government. They are walls that have been built to keep the government out of our personal lives. They're what theorists call negative rights. This is a really central idea to liberalism. It was a form of government that was built for the explicit reason of keeping the government small and outside of any interference in our daily lives. But if we go back to all those people that the rich white men left out and ask them what they want enshrined as human rights, they might have different ideas. They might say, for example, that it's all well and good to have freedom of speech, but that if you never actually get an education and can't develop thoughtful opinions, that freedom of speech is pointless because you just can't get there. So they would say, I'd like freedom of education to be included on your list of rights. This is a fundamentally different type of right. It's what rights theorists call a positive right, and in that it doesn't say to the government, keep away, but it says, get involved. It says you need to provide me with something. In order to provide an education, the government needs to levy taxes, and the people that really hate being taxed are the people that wrote that first document of rights. Rich white men don't really need a right to an education because they can afford to get an education. To them, they prefer the right not to be taxed. To them, that sounds like a better right. So as more people were brought to the table, more rights were proposed, and a lot of times these rights were very much at odds with what the original theorists had in mind, particularly when it came to limiting government size. That brings us to the second covenant, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This treaty includes the right to health, the right to education, labor rights, the right to an adequate standard of living, all of which would be considered positive rights. And as of today, this treaty has been adopted by nearly every country in the world, with the exception of the United States, and a lot of these down here weren't even around when they first adopted it. So yeah, the United States and Cuba, pretty much. So now that we mostly have our rights agreed to globally, we should ask ourselves a question. Isn't it kind of impossible to come up with universal laws in this sense? Because the living circumstances of every person are different from person to person. Can any one law cover every human being? We've already seen that when people look for self-evident truths, they tend to find truths that disproportionately benefit themselves. And if we reject the idea that rights are God-given, as most of the people in this room probably would, we'd have to find their grounding elsewhere. Many philosophers have attempted to take a less God-centric and more rationalist approach at justifying rights, but there are a few problems with this. First, obviously, trying to justify a concept after the fact is called rationalization, and it's a type of logical fallacy. The more intellectually honest, if less politically expedient thing to do is to kind of start from scratch. And the second is to say that humans deserve human rights because they are humans. Second, you can't just say that, because that's circular logic. Every rational justification for human rights that we've come up with was either wasn't capable of covering all humans or covered beings that weren't humans. So to just use one example, if we say that the reason we're owed rights is because we have the capacity to reason, that applies to monkeys. Monkeys are capable of reason too. And so a lot of people wouldn't want to extend human rights to monkeys or to other animals that have these capacities. The more uncomfortable question is if a human is very young, very old, or very severely disabled and are not capable of reasoning in any real way, do they not deserve rights? Most people don't want to go there. So next we'll go into Immanuel Kant. Even setting the concept of rights aside, morality is really tricky to construct using solely rational thought. It was most successfully attempted by the Enlightenment thinker Immanuel Kant, and most of us would probably not adopt his philosophy, and I can explain why. Kant famously invented something called the categorical imperative. He phrased it as this: act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. The idea being that if an action is right, it's right all the time, and it's right in literally every situation. So he said, for example, that no one should ever lie. This sounds nice on paper, but once you put it into practice in the real world, it gets a lot stickier. An axe murderer could come up to you and say, as axe murderers do, I'd like to axe murder your family. Can you please tell me where they are? And Kant said that you had to tell him where they are, and said, well, if everyone followed the categorical imperative, then the axe murderer wouldn't murder your family, because one of the rules is not to murder people. But the real world is never that clean. And we just wouldn't do this. None of us, we would all think that it's very obviously silly to think this way. But that is the issue with universal laws. They're universal, they're unbending, and they don't have much space for changing over time. The right to bear arms makes perfect sense when you are a brand new republic and you're worried about slipping back towards tyranny. It makes a lot less sense when there are kids being machine gunned in their schools. So, this attempt to impose top-down moral laws on the human world is a byproduct of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment has done an enormous amount of good in its promotion of the scientific method and its emphasis on freedom, fairness, and reason. But the Enlightenment thinkers believed that we lived in a clockwork universe. In that era, before Darwin, before Einstein, there were still relatively few scientists and thinkers who did not believe in the existence of God or some form of a creator. They mostly believed that the laws of physics were rigid and universal, and that through their use of reason, they would have everything figured out in a relatively short period of time. So famously, in 1900, the Scottish physicist Lord Kelvin said, "There is nothing new to be discovered in physics right now. All that remains is more and more precise measurement." It was reasonable in that type of world to think that if there were clear, perceivable natural laws, there would also be clear, perceivable moral laws. Kelvin said that in 1900. That is right around when Einstein published the theory of relativity. It's right around when quantum mechanics came onto the scene and basically blew up everything that we knew. Now, a century later, we're still trying to unite these apparently contradictory fields, and we're facing the possibility, as the British biologist J.B.S. Haldane put it, that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. We have no idea, accepting the idea that an ant, for example, can't grasp relativity. So why shouldn't we assume that there aren't elements of existence that we just can't grasp? We may just lack the hardware you'd actually need to be able to fully understand it all. The religious impulse, when confronting this humbling and somewhat terrifying possibility, is to retreat back into comforting lies and ignorance, into a world of moral absolutes. We as humanists do not have to do the same. We can instead choose to approach the world with the same curiosity, the moral world with the same curiosity that we approach the scientific world. That does mean abandoning a top-down, absolute morality derived from reason, though. This is easier than it sounds. So the primatologist and humanist Franz de Waal, in his excellent book, The Bonobo and the Atheist, suggested that if we look to our genetic cousins, the chimps and bonobos, we will see that moral behavior exists in the world without reference to reason or rationality. Which isn't to say that primates aren't capable of these things, it's just that, because they very much are, it's just that their moral behavior comes from elsewhere. So any attempt to base human rationality on, or human morality on reason is misguided. So de Waal wrote, quote, "The confusion seems to stem from the illusion that all we need for a good society is more knowledge. Once we've figured out the central algorithm of morality, so the thinking goes, we can safely hand things over to science. Science will guarantee the best choices. This is a bit like thinking that a celebrated art critic must be a great painter, or a food critic a great chef. The view of morality as a set of immutable principles or laws that are ours to discover ultimately comes from religion. It doesn't really matter whether it is God, human reason, or science that formulates these laws. All these approaches share a top-down orientation, their chief premise being that humans don't know how to behave and someone must tell them. But what if morality is created in day-to-day social interaction, not at some abstract mental level? What if it is grounded in the emotions, which most of the time escape the neat categorizations that science is fond of? My views are in line with the way that we know the human mind works, with visceral reactions arriving before rationalizations, and also the way evolution produces behavior. A good place to start is with the acknowledgement of our background as social animals and how this background predisposes us to treat each other." Unquote. It may still be tempting as secularists to believe that because we're not referring to a millennium-old holy book for our morality, that our reason-based approach will be superior. So let's just put that to the test real fast. We'll take the most universally embraced moral rule by secularists and see what we have to say about it. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's the golden rule. It's really beautiful. It's really simple. It's a rule that's arisen independently in many cultures and many religions, both theistic and atheistic, and it is an excellent rule to live by. It is not universal. There is a 21st century phenomenon that derails the logic of the golden rule. This phenomenon is the sending of unsolicited penis photos to women in dating apps, or as they're known, dick pics. Dick pics, nearly everyone agrees, are repellent, but they follow the logic of the golden rule. The dick pic sender is basically saying, "Hello, kind stranger. I would like to see naked pictures of you. Here, as a show of good faith, is a picture of me." This loophole is a pretty glaring one. Not everyone wants to be treated in the same way. So it's a very good guideline, but like all guidelines, there's a point at which the ethical thing to do is abandon it. With this in mind, we should look at how the international human rights regime has played out in the real world. So again, before I go any further, I should acknowledge that the existence of human rights as a tool has been literally life-saving to thousands, if not millions of people, when they've been applied in good faith. For example, we've got a famous human rights organization, Amnesty International. They've helped free thousands of political prisoners, or as they call them, prisoners of conscience, through letter writing campaigns over the past several decades. People like Malala Yousafzai, Desmond Tutu, Martin Luther King Jr., all of them grounded their work in the language of human rights. And organizations like Doctors Without Borders have predicated their existence on the idea that healthcare is a universal human right. But rights are a tool, and like all tools, they can be used for good or for ill. The human rights mantra post-Holocaust was never again. The irony of this is that it's continued happening over and over and over again since then. The existence of a strong international human rights regime was not sufficient to protect the Rwandan Tutsis or the Bosniaks at Srebrenica. The photo you see in this slide is Chong Ek. It's a pagoda built in the killing fields of Cambodia. It is literally filled to the brim with skulls. The war crimes trials against the Khmer Rouge didn't begin until 9 years ago, in 2009. A lot of them were dead at that point. Likewise, human rights have been used as a disingenuous justification for both the Vietnam and Iraq wars. They're regularly used now as excuses to bomb the bejesus out of countries that may not have the freedom of religion or freedom of speech that we so support, but also don't have access to clean drinking water or basic health care, and which we seem to take less of an issue with those rights. We care more about the freedom of speech. Usually the rights here are used to cloak political or economic interests. On a smaller, more localized level, rights are often used to muddy the waters of a debate. So count how many times that you've maybe pointed out on Facebook or Twitter that right-wing internet trolls shouldn't be allowed to anonymously give rape threats to feminists, and have been told that that would be somehow a violation of their free speech. Because we see rights as unbendable and unbreaking, we stop thinking of them as what they are, which is at the very basic level value judgments, and we lose our capacity for nuance. Instead, we all become these legal scholars. We're citing rulings and precedents, and this really legalistic way of looking at the world is a bit of a problem, as we've seen, for example, with the recent immigration debate, with very well-meaning people arguing that the undocumented people broke the law while never taking a second to ask, is the law just in the first place? In reality, when victories are won for human rights, they're not won because a government has decided to grant the rights to certain citizens. It just never happens. Governments don't give away powers or freedoms of their own accord. Rights are won by grassroots, bottom-up movements. The most obvious example of this is American voting rights. Now, African Americans in the United States got the right to vote by law in 1868 with the ratification of the 14th Amendment. They did not, in practice, have that vote until nearly 100 years later with the Civil Rights Act. This was after decades of resistance, grassroots protests, and campaigns. And this pattern repeats itself over and over. Freedom is really not granted by logic and legalism of an intellectual or elite class. It is won in struggle by people who are fighting for their dignity. Put simply, the idea at the core of human rights is solid. The core of human rights is an emphasis on human dignity. But dignity is subjective. For some, it might be the right to wear a headscarf wherever they please. For others, it might be the right to not be forced to wear that headscarf. So treating someone with dignity means treating them as an end, not as a means to an end. At the core of the idea of dignity is that we're autonomous creatures and that we should be allowed to make decisions for ourselves so far as they don't harm others. But that type of debate relies on subjectivity, which makes it much messier. It means that we have to actually speak to each other, and harder still, trust each other and trust that we're telling the truth. It would be much cleaner and easier, we imagine, to govern people from the outside in reference to these global universal laws. So, we're now about a fifth of the way through the 21st century, and it is possible that humanity does not make it through the rest. At the moment, there are two great threats to mankind's continued existence, and they do not come from the realms of religion or supernatural belief. The first feels old to most of us, but nuclear war is still a very real possibility. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists currently has their doomsday clock at 2 minutes to midnight. The last time it was here was 1953, at the height of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons, of course, owe their existence solely to the discoveries of the 20th century's great physicists. Their use has been pushed by religious and political fundamentalists, true, including some current world leaders who have no regard for science whatsoever, but the point remains that these tools of destruction could not exist without science. Now, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists started in 2007 to factor in the other great existential threat, which may explain why it's closer to midnight now than it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Climate change, of course, is fueled by exponential economic and population growth, both of which are byproducts of global capitalism. Capitalism got its start during the liberal era because both systems place a heavy emphasis on freedom and non-interference from the government. So this quote is from the Club of Rome in 1972. If the present growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and resource depletion continue unchanged, the limits to growth will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. The most probable result will be a rather sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. They wrote this in a book called The Limits to Growth. It was, as I said, it was first published in 1972, and pretty much all the predictions that they made are on track as of their last update in 2004, and you may notice that this was 46 years ago. It's a century, we're most of the way through it, almost most of the way through it. So again, the forces of unsustainable growth have often been fueled by fundamentalists. Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, James Watt, famously said in response to climate change, "I do not know how many future generations we can count on before the Lord returns." Obviously, it's not just the rationalists that are to blame, but capitalism was founded on the very solid Enlightenment idea of rational self-interest. It is this same rational self-interest that underpins the liberal idea of human rights. That brings us, as humanists, to a crucial point. We've effectively won in the marketplace of ideas, but we're now in a situation where the true threats to humankind come from our traditional allies. You know, we've always been proponents of reason, science, and individual freedom, but we may have come to a point where we have to admit that these forces are not in and of themselves moral forces. We may have to admit that there is a dividing line between the world of objective physical truth and subjective human morality, and stop holding out hope that reason alone can provide us with some sort of moral compass, or that scientific progress will somehow propel us into a more moral future. Excuse me. So the time to grapple with humanist morality, I think, is now. I suggest that we stop holding out hope that human rationality will hand us down a list of moral laws on stone tablets. And instead, holding dignity up as a core value, we begin constructing a democratic, non-dogmatic, bottom-up morality that puts discussion, compassion, and mutual respect at its core. So, if we're rejecting the idea that any one philosophy has uncovered the absolute truth of morality, we can choose instead to see moral philosophy as a toolkit, offering us ideas that may be useful in some situations and useless in others. There is a scientific analogy for this method. Physicists lacking a grand unified theory of physics rely on Newtonian physics for the human scale, relativity for the cosmic scale, quantum mechanics for the subatomic scale, understanding that each of these does a very good job of explaining what it was meant to explain, but that each of these starts falling apart when applied outside of its corresponding realm. So we, trying to develop a comprehensive humanist morality, might hope, as the physicists do, that we will someday be able to bring it all together. But for now, flexibility is the most rational approach. So, what else is in the moral toolkit? We've looked at liberalism, let's look at 4 of the other alternatives. So this is utilitarianism, and it's probably the most popular outside of liberalism. Utilitarians argue that if all lives are equal, the right thing to do is to keep overall suffering to a bare minimum. They argue that if you have the choice between killing 1 person to save 5, the morally right thing to do would be to kill that 1 person. Rights, a utilitarian would argue, would get in the way of protecting these 5 other people. This contains a cold logic that a lot of us could bring ourselves to adopt in some situations. If you take, for example, the famous trolley problem. By the way, a lot of what I'm talking about is in the show The Good Place. It's an incredible show that really focuses a lot on moral philosophy in a really fun way. So if you want to get more into it, watch that show. The trolley problem is basically this. You are the person standing with your hand on the lever. The 5 people, you have a choice to redirect the trolley, which is careening out of control, and it's going to either kill 1 person or 5 people, and you can choose whether it's going to go for the 1 person rather than the 5. All sorts of different approaches are thrown into this. Sometimes the 1 person is a family member. Sometimes the 1 person is, a really important person, and the other 5 people, who's going to invent the cure for cancer, and the other 5 people are just normal Joe Schmoes. But basically, the idea is you're trying to make judgments on how much lives matter in this type of situation. This gets a little bit less abstract and a little bit more frightening to most of us if you are a totally healthy adult with healthy human organs, and your doctor decides that he's just going to go ahead and take those organs to save 5 of his sick patients. Most of us in this case are pretty happy that our doctor is not a utilitarian. We're pretty happy that they've said first do no harm. But when it comes to governance, especially of large numbers of people, you could do worse than to adopt a utilitarian mindset and reduce suffering as much as possible. The second alternative is Marxism. To the Marxist, the liberal government is inherently unjust because it inevitably leads to divided social classes, and this makes inequality inevitable. Here they would point to the fact that which we've already mentioned, which is that rights are chosen when they're chosen by the rich, they tend to benefit the rich. And they would say that putting protections onto an unjust system is like putting a Band-Aid onto a gaping wound. Better instead to change the system entirely. Marxists are better at offering critiques than they are at building their own systems. But they are right that structural injustice is a real thing, and that by building better systems we could reduce suffering. And they also deserve a lot of credit for being a pretty central force in pushing liberal governments in the West to make a lot of their more humane reforms over the past century and a half. So, third is the feminist critiques, which are the newest ones. The main one, the most prominent one now, is called the ethics of care. Ethics of care is not the only feminist ethical system, but it basically says that universal laws can breed moral blindness, and that this approach to ethics is a mostly masculine one. They suggest that we instead adopt what they call the ethics of care, which is that rather than focusing on abstract principles of justice, we should focus on compassion and empathy. The feminist criticism has been around for the least amount of time, but it is pretty close in keeping with Franz de Waal's argument about how morality actually evolved. And considering that moral philosophy was and remains very heavily dominated by men, and again, mostly rich white men at that, it makes sense to start paying closer attention to a feminist perspective. Fourth and finally is communitarianism. I couldn't find a good comic for this, so I just did the I would like to buy the world a Coke thing. So communitarianism exists that it insists that it doesn't make sense to try and divorce individuals from their communities. Because we are so often very thoroughly defined by our personal relationships, our communities, our histories, and the context we grew up in, trying to see us as cold, separate individuals doesn't make much sense. Our communitarian then suggests that what is right is what the community decides is right. Obviously, in this type of world, many communities would come to very different conclusions about what is right for them. And to a communitarian, this is okay. This is why all the other moral philosophies call them moral relativists. Moral relativism has its dangers, as we've seen, but so does moral absolutism. And in my view, they're correct to point out that it is impossible to divorce a human from their community. Very few of us end up becoming hermits in the woods when we reject the idea reject the society that we're living in. So any biologist will tell you, for example, that you can't study an organism without studying their environment. So why we think we're exempt from this rule is beyond me. So all of these alternative systems of thought have something to offer us in the way that we think about the world. So let's talk about humanism in the 21st century. If human rights have been the bedrock of rationalist and humanist morality for the past few centuries, and if human rights do not have the solid rational foundation that a non-believer would prefer, how do we go forward? The core value behind human rights is human dignity, and I believe that this value is still a good one to hold on to. You can still make this less human-centric, if you like, and you can just say dignity and apply it to all sentient beings. But really where rights went wrong is in trying to apply universal laws to human dignity. Because each person's idea of dignity is their own, the only way that we can learn about it is by asking them and trusting them when they answer. To simply project our idea of dignity out onto the world is laziness. Doing so means we'll just keep creating societies like our current one, where only really a few groups get to live in what they consider to be dignity. I believe humanists are actually uniquely placed to push forward this non-dogmatic approach to morality, but they have to do a few things differently. The first is to abandon, at least for the moment, any attempt to discover a top-down morality in the world. Rationality and reason alone will not get us there. Morality is decided by communities, not through scientific inquiry. Science can inform the decisions that we make, but ultimately the way we decide what we want to be is by talking with each other and trusting each other. Bills of rights are very helpful mission statements, but they should always be seen as living documents, not as fossilized truths. The second thing we have to recognize is that our vision of ourselves as rational individuals is incomplete. For one thing, I think in the last few years in the realm of politics, we may have noticed that humans aren't all that rational. And for another, this idea of every man participating in a community out of rational self-interest is just wrong. It is based on a thought experiment, not on actual history. We participate in communities because we must and because we evolved to do so. A human without a community is an incomplete human. People who say that the individual is the only thing that matters are flatly wrong. Knowing this, it seems to me, makes it clear that our biggest fights in the 21st century will not be with religion, but with self-interest masquerading as rationality. It'll be with free market libertarians who are undermining climate science and their rational self-interest, even though they know full well that our society's current trajectory is catastrophic. It'll be with pragmatic militarists who are threatening a descent into a new Cold War and possibly a nuclear annihilation because they say a defensive stance is, towards the world is a rational thing to do. And it'll be towards vested interests that are using the cloak of human rights to disguise the true reasons behind humanitarian interventions. Knowing this, we're going to have to understand that our preferred tools, reason, science, and human rights, can all be used against the best interest of the human race, and that this may be more dangerous than actual superstition. The real battle, I think, is no longer knowledge versus ignorance, but curiosity versus fear. A fearful person, as many of us know firsthand, is not going to change his mind when confronted with the facts. A curious person will. If we can shift our movement away from picking fights with the ignorant and towards inspiring curiosity and creativity, we'll be an immense force for good in the 21st century. We already have a very excellent guiding document available to us. I'm sure many of you have read it, but the third and most recent Humanist Manifesto, released by the American Humanists Association, is a brilliant mission statement, so long as we stick to it. Here's a little bit from it. Ethical values are derived from human need and interest as tested by experience. Humanists ground values in human welfare shaped by human circumstances, interests, and concerns, and extended to the global ecosystem and beyond. We are committed to treating each person as having inherent worth and dignity, and to making informed choices in a context of freedom consonant with responsibility. So human rights have been really an effective tool for protecting the world's vulnerable people, but we should always be aware that they are, like all tools, useful only some of the time, and they can be used for nefarious ends by people who, on their face, appear to be allies. The life stance of humanism is, quote, guided by reason, inspired by compassion, and informed by experience. All three of these are needed. Reason alone will not get us there. My hope in giving this speech is that we as humanists not only continue to reject moral absolutism, but we develop a honed suspicion towards it, and not allow it to be ghosted into our way of thinking in the form of appealing but antiquated Enlightenment ideas. My hope is, in short, that you continue putting Kurt Vonnegut into kids' hands and not Ayn Rand. Millions of new 15-year-old atheists are depending on that. So thank you for your time. You can do questions now if you like.
Okay, well, we indeed do questions, and I'll bring the mic around. So we've been having a little trouble with these mics, and we are ordering new ones. Hopefully it'll hold out. Please wait for the mic not only to amplify your voice, but also to have only one person talking at a time. But now if you have questions, it's a good time to raise your hand. Come around and see. Okay. I'm first going to go around. First hand I saw was way back here with Alex.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the events that occurred in history that inspired the authors of constitutions to start adding freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and so on. I'm speculating that there was some kind of violent hints.
Yeah, so the two major events that kind of led to the initial idea of human rights were the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And in both of those places, freedom of speech just wasn't really a thing. And the rationalists who were kind of coming out of the Enlightenment rightfully pointed out that ideas flourish best when they actually get to fight with each other and they're not repressed. So in the example of really in the U.S. I think it was a little bit more exaggerated because there was some level of freedom of speech because they did have limits on the monarchy in England, unlike in places like France or a lot of the rest of Europe. But basically, as the revolutions kind of came, they saw this opportunity to really make that like the law of the land. And we kind of lucked out that in the U.S. and well, less so in France because France backslid pretty hard. But in the U.S., those actually did get kind of set into the founding bill of documents, and it was people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington who like really kind of pushed that. But you know, again, both of those people did own slaves. So you know, they were forward thinking for their time in a lot of ways. That doesn't really excuse slavery, but they actually did you know, realize that they would have a stronger society if they had that. So those were the two initial events that did it, and then liberalism kind of expanded in popularity throughout the 19th century as global capitalism got stronger. Because basically, as you have a stronger middle class, they're going to really start to push these things, and that's the class that really ended up pushing a lot of the liberal ideas, was the middle and capitalist classes of these countries.
All right, I have two things. First of all, at the celebration last week, my wife was asked for a recipe for her cauliflower casserole, and I brought some of those. So if you want it, come see me. And secondly, speaking of the 21st century, artificial intelligence is taking more and more responsibility for some simple decisions being made in medicine and law. But as they get more sophisticated, you know, of those 4 tools in the toolbox that you mentioned, I was just wondering what you think would be the best one for artificial intelligence making some of those decisions. Utilitarianism makes the most sense, but, you know.
I'm not really in favor of handing it over to robots. I mean, I probably watched too many like Terminator things growing up, but I think that you know, when AIs are used to enhance a lot of grids or a lot of traffic grids in towns. Like some cities have started, you know, setting it up with artificial intelligence running like their stoplights. That's fine. I think that we would want to keep that extremely limited. So I would actually probably go to liberalism for that. Like keep it as small as possible, because I think people frequently try and say that technology can just fix all of these things, but one of the things in the Limits to Growth, the Club of Rome thing that I read from, was that they pointed out that technology will help us a lot with for example, like fighting climate change, but it won't get us all the way there because of the nature of exponential growth. It won't get us there, and so we can rely and kind of try and advance these technologies, but we shouldn't hope that they're just going to solve everything. I think that we did talk in our course about like whether robots get rights. Like at what point is something sentient enough on its own to actually get its own protections? And no one has a good answer for that. So yeah, I don't know I don't know what we would do with that. I would want to keep it limited personally, just because I want to be making decisions. I don't want
Big mistake slowly.
I agree.
yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's for that one.
Yeah, thanks for a really good talk. I'm here this morning with about 45 other humanists. But to get here, I passed several churches, and just looking at the number of cars, there's many, many, many more people in this area who are in church this morning. So I feel like we humanists are kind of an island in the sea of irrational religious types. How do you think we should be behaving and acting as we interact with the rest of the community?
I'm pretty impressed with the Red Bank Humanists. I've lived plenty of other places and haven't really, even much larger places, and haven't seen groups this large. So I know that not everyone is in Red Bank, but you know, this is actually encouraging to me in a lot of ways. I do think that you know, one of my, and I spent years just reading people like Christopher Hitchens and a lot of, you know, take these kind of like combative stances towards religion. I think just reading, you know, and coming to humanism from Kurt Vonnegut or from like something like the Humanist Manifesto, that's a really solid, positive vision. And I think that if the fights are less about fighting religion and pointing out everything that they get wrong and more about putting forward a positive vision of the world, I think that that's probably a more productive way for humanists to go forward. I'm not interested in fighting with the religious anymore. I remember like I I've just stopped arguing with like stuff like Darwinism and climate change, because I know that I'm trying to reason with basically an irrational force, and there's no real point to it. And so I don't know, to the extent that we can like protect that on a political level and keep like those people from kind of like invading and saying like, you know, we should teach our kids the 10 Commandments, then that's great. But I think that on a personal level, trying to promote a positive vision of what humanity can be is probably a more productive stance. I think that, and it seems like that's something that's happening here. And so I think that, you know, if we can do more of that and less of this just kind of, you know, Hitchens kind of like picking fights and trying to give all of our religious family members copies of God Is Not Great, which I may have done a few times, and it didn't work. But, you know, like I think that, yeah, if there can be more groups like this one and keep like kind of trying to expand out, and actually, you know, one of the things that I remember my mother saying to me when I was first becoming an atheist was that, well, you never see the atheists actually out there volunteering. And I said, well, that's because you're volunteering at churches. And, but I think that we do have smaller numbers, and I think that when people see groups like the Red Bank Humanists out and doing stuff, and when they see them, like, you know, raising money for HabCorp and things like that, then I think that that shows that, you know, that it's not this scary thing. I think for a lot of people who are religious, the idea of atheism is this terrifying idea, and it's not, but they're not going to know it's not unless we're out there doing positive things and not just picking fights with them because, you know, we're angry about religion, which we justifiably are, but, yeah.
Hi, I have a question. One of your presentations had to do with people or part of a greater community.
Mm-hmm.
Now, your philosophy being based on that, frankly, most people, the community is a hierarchy. You have yourself, your family, your friends, local people. The rest of the world is like way, way, way down on the list.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we have riots in Paris for weeks. And it all has to do with their own personal situation, economics.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they don't have any money, taxes are going up ostensibly to protect the environment. They are not accepting this. Now, how do you propose to get everybody to sign on, you know, saving the world when they're more interested in saving themselves? Now, that's pretty basic biological imperative.
I don't see how saving yourself doesn't involve saving the world. I think that especially, I've got a 10-month-old baby, and you know, and I've talked to a lot of other parents who have similarly aged kids, and a lot of people are really terrified about the next several decades, and so I think that there are you know, and I think that that's a valid thing. If you're poor and you're living in France and you're getting taxed, and there are very, very rich people who aren't getting taxed at a just level, then I think that that's a valid thing for them to be upset about. But when it comes to thinking about the world, I think that more and more people are thinking like, oh, we've just kind of been self-interested. That's going to hit a wall very soon. There's a concept in ecology called the tragedy of the commons. Which is basically if you have a well in a town and every single person takes whatever they need from it, eventually the well will run dry. And that's not in anyone's long-term self-interest. I think that what we have to have is we have to people thinking more long-term self-interest. And long-term self-interest is interest in the entire world. It's in the community and the state and the country and the globe at large. And so, you know, the way that you fix something like the tragedy of the commons, if you start taking the long view, is you actually have rationing, and you actually, you know, factor in like replenishment of the resource. So I think that hopefully going forward, more people are thinking in a long-term kind of global sense, and I do think that, you know, it can sound corny, but I think the, like, you know, think globally, act locally kind of maxim is really useful in that sense, because most of the things that we actually have the power to do are here. You know, and I do think that there's a lot that Red Bank especially is doing to kind of, you know, for environmental stuff. But, you know, every community everywhere needs to do that, and they're going to need to, you know, people basically need to decide that they have the power to do that in a small way locally, rather than kind of feeling despair looking at it internationally. And if more people thought that way, then we would be in a different situation.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah. I mean, we might all be just doomed. I mean, that's very much a possibility. But like, you know, I think that the only moral way of going forward is assuming that we're not, and trying to act as if we can change things. So, yeah.
Yes, I'd like to maybe give 2 comments and then see how you feel about it. Well, the first one is the closest right here about the French situation. I mean, I speak French, I've been following it, and I think that the movement over there is not only in Paris, it's all over the country. And it's not so much about, not, wanting to protect the climate. I think it's about the injustice. That, the government not only does not tax, the rich, or actually back off some taxes that they had there, right, and substituting, giving back to the very rich, and substituting that income by, taxing the general population. And of course, it's unjust because the percentage is different if you're poor, than if you're rich, right? And also not taxing the very polluting industries there. So it's a very, very unequal, and it's situation. I think the French are reacting to that. French population is reacting to that. My second comment was about I don't remember. That he was asking how what struggles really pushed the envelope on the Human Rights Declaration. And one comment I wanted to put there is the back in the 1789 to 1804, there was a very big struggle, anti-slavery struggle in the island of Saint-Domingue, which the French part. And actually it is the slaves that pushed the envelope on including, slavery as, anti-human right, anti-slavery as, a fundamental human rights, and basically put people of color on the map. It was the actual battles that happened there. And of course the international context that the French had to back up and say, yeah, you also can be free, but initially it did not include people of color. So, now we're faced with a situation where you have a majority that, in this country that doesn't want to see climate change, doesn't want to see, some rational, what do you expect is going to happen? Is there going to be some fundamental changes, or how do you see this happening? Because it's really something that, we're confronted with,
Yeah. As far as, I mean, I can't read the future. If the people like the Club of Rome are right, we're going to change whether we like it or not. And I think that there have been a lot of activists who have said, like the change is coming, and we kind of have to choose how good it is. It could very much be a weak system that we have in place, but when it comes to actual human rights being implemented in the world, I mean, it really is like in the Haitian Revolution, like that's the only thing that ever gets something done is by people rising up in some way. And there are different ways to do it. It doesn't always have to be a violent revolution. In the case of slaves, it probably did need to be in Haiti and in the United States. But just in England, for example, they slowly phased out slavery, decades before a lot of the other European countries, and it was from a grassroots movement led by people like, I think it was William Wilberforce was the main one. But they had, it was these people who were out there agitating and organizing and really doing a lot of just, hard groundwork that eventually got their governments to change. And I think that maybe our government right now is in a particularly intractable place where it doesn't hear a lot of the mass movements, but it does break eventually. That type, I mean, Lyndon B. Johnson was hardly not a racist, but he's the one that ended up signing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. I mean, and it was because of the enormous political pressure that a lot of the activist movements placed on them. Politicians are very good at responding to things that are threats to their power, and if you organize in that way, and and the human rights is a really good way of talking about it, even if it isn't always a perfect way of thinking about it. Then I think that that's the only way it can go forward. Otherwise, it's just kind of catastrophe. Yeah.
Well, what precipitated the final break with France and Haiti was the politics of the Napoleon was to basically kill, massacre all non-whites from 8-year-old, until, so just basically replace, he wanted to reestablish slavery, and therefore, those that were free and, free in the society had to be eliminated, and that precipitated.
Yeah, and that's like kind of, it's interesting because Haiti was, you saw it a little bit, it's a similar thing with like Marxism during the Cold War, but Haiti was used for a lot of early United States as kind of the specter used by the South in the United States is like, well, what if Haiti happens? What if they rise up and kill us? And I think that, any sort of violent revolution is almost inevitably followed by some form of repression, and also the United States practiced some pretty awful policies towards Haiti for centuries. Still is not doing a great job with helping Haiti to develop, and so it's not a totally hopeful picture, but yeah, I mean you have to do something, and it's you kind of hope that the whole arc of the universe is long thing is correct.
Thanks for the talk. I need to have 10 words or less of something, maybe use a few more. The relationship, the things we talked about, sense of community and taxes, environment and everything, is really indifferent to religion. And what I need to have a few more words on is, where does a humanist place in the context of these issues, societal issues, versus God-fearing, or whatever you call it, person?
I think humanists are better placed to do. I mean, first of all, some credit is there are some religious groups that are doing a lot for stuff like climate and for I think that because humanists have this emphasis on here and now and not on any sort of afterlife and on human dignity, we're almost uniquely placed in that for us that concept of heaven and hell have to be here on earth. Like we get to build it here, and that's a pretty strong ideology for a time with a lot of crisis. So I think that we're probably better placed than a lot of these, because I know a lot of people who are religious who just don't think about climate change because it's well, this is what God willed, or this is too big and so it's out of my hands, and that's kind of their approach to it, whereas that's not an option for a humanist mindset. So a humanist mindset has to be a more active one, because you don't have these kind of resignations, I think, that a lot of religious, not all religious people, but a lot of religious people have.
Hey, how's it going? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name is Kate Chigiano. I was actually fortunate enough to be elected to council here in Red Bank. I have a lot of friends in the room. For those who don't know me, it's nice to meet you, and it's nice. I had never actually, even though I see so many good friends here, I didn't know this group even existed, so my mind is, I'm like, I'm sorry, what? I'm fortunate enough to be newer friends with Matt, and thank you for inviting me. My question is kind of trivial. I'll be getting sworn in on January 1st, and I have been thinking about this so much. I'm like, do I respect my grandma by using her Bible and just giving her a very nice symbolic moment because she's, a great woman who really helped me become, the feminist that I am? Or do I pick a different book and then, then they go, oh, Radical Kate, of course she couldn't just do it on the Bible. So this is something that I've been trying to piece together, so I wanted to see if you had any advice. If you were getting sworn into government, what book or object would you use?
Oh, God.
Slaughterhouse 5.
Yeah. Actually, that's top on my,
Well, trying to get reelected.
Yeah, okay. I can't help you. All right, one thing, my wife and I, we got married, and we both come from Catholic families, and we decided not to do a Catholic Mass, and the way that we did it was we wrote everything from scratch. And the way that we sold it to our families who had differing levels of excitement about what we were doing was that, you know, we were doing stuff that we believed in, and we wanted, and we kind of said, like, you know, you guys, this is very important to you. We don't want to disrespect it by basically making this important day a lie and constantly lying to people. And that seems to go over pretty well. Our readings we had Vonnegut, we both quoted Vonnegut in it at different points, and we also had a reading from a book about climate change. The reading wasn't on climate change, it was about love, but it was from a novel about climate change. And so, you know, but we did that and we kind of made it our own thing, and I think that the people who were taking us in good faith would respect it, and probably the people calling you Radical Kate aren't really going to take whatever you do in good faith. So, I don't know. I like the, you know, with the, when we've been able to kind of present it as we're doing what's right for us, and we're doing things that we believe in, and people respect you when you're doing things that you believe in, especially for so many people when being like an atheist means, well, you just believe in nothing then. And that's an argument I've had to have 10,000. It's like, no, I don't believe in nothing, I just don't believe in God. And, you know, that has worked out very well for us in our family, but our family loves us and they're not political opponents. And so, good luck.
I just thought it would be fun. It's a fun question. I mean, the survey's out.
I've got some advice for you, because I've been in town for a long time, and I've had to, you know, testify in court or whatever, and everyone in the town has always been fine with me saying, you know, like, I'm not religious, and, you know, instead of like, do you swear to God to tell the truth? You know, they just say, all right, affirm. Can you affirm that? I say, all right, affirm. And no one says anything. So I think it's a progressive community. It's a pretty liberal community, and I think no one's going to give a bad an eye. And even our mayor, who is uber religious, who I know, he knows about our group and the humanist group, and he's worked with us to get humanists and non-believers onto the records in Red Bank. So there's already a precedent of acceptance.
My son-in-law became a captain with police, and he was the first one there who did not put his hand on the Bible. All he had to do was affirm. And if you call I think the legal team from the American Humanists, and you talk to someone there, they'll tell you what you can do. But all you have to do is say, I affirm.
And the walls won't come crumbling down.
And there was we thought, you know, that people be burning torches on the front lawn because they knew everybody in town. And nothing happened. It was like a big nothing. And they thought, oh my goodness, this is terrible. The first time somebody never used the Bible to put their hand on. And it was like no big deal.
Yeah.
So, you know, probably would be the same.
There is a corollary to your trolley story.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when people are told the trolley story and asked, what would you do? A sizable majority said, I'll pull the lever. But now change the situation and you're standing on a bridge. Here comes the runaway trolley car. You've heard this before because you're smiling, right? Here comes the trolley car, and now your choice is that there are 3 people down on the track, don't know the trolley's coming, so what you do is you push this young man over the bridge. He lands on the ground, stops the trolley, saves the 3 people. Now, when they ask the people, would you do that? There's a great reluctance. Even though the result is exactly the same, right? When you physically touch a person, that seems to be a lot worse than pulling the lever, because pulling the lever, you're kind of away from things, but physically pushing, there's a lot less people that say, I would do that.
Yeah, the really interesting thing about utilitarianism is it's really coldly logical in a lot of ways, but it's very hard to live. So the most famous living utilitarian is a guy named Peter Singer. Peter Singer wrote he's got really excellent books. He has one called The Life You Can Save, which is about charitable giving, which is focused on trying to save as many lives as possible, and they've developed this giant movement which is turning out to be very effective. He also is one of the leading proponents of, he wrote the book Animal Liberation, so of a lot of the vegetarian and the vegan movements. If you don't want to become a vegetarian, don't read the book. I did for the class I'm teaching in the spring, and now I can't eat meat anymore, and I hate it. But so, you know, but the problem is, it came out, he said that, you know, that everyone should be treated equal, everyone should get, you know, equal, you know, healthcare shouldn't be beneficial to, you know, everyone should get the same rights with healthcare. It came out that he was paying for his mother-in-law's hospice care. And people were like, well, if you believe that everyone should get it, you know, that if everyone should get equal, then why are you paying out of your pocket for this personal thing? That's not very utilitarian. He just said, yeah. I mean, he kind of didn't have a defense with it. He's like, yeah, I'm being a hypocrite, and you know, that's kind of it. And so I think utilitarianism is a useful way for thinking about stuff like that, but a lot of it goes very counter to our way of actually existing in the world. And it is, you know, that when you do have, like, and you know, this is part of the problem with something like the Holocaust, is that the Nazis did a very good job of mechanizing it. And so for a lot of people, they weren't, you know, there wasn't, you know, there were plenty of people that were shot, but a lot of the deaths were in gas chambers where people could kind of distance themselves, and they have this machinery for doing it. And if you do that, you get people a lot more willing to do terrible things. There's a similar thought experiment, you know, your button's pushed, set in front of you, and if you push it, you get $1 million, but someone somewhere in the world dies. And, you know, asking people what they would do with that. I think they ended up making a movie off of it. But, you know, like you know, these kind of things are really tricky, and that's easy because you can distance yourself from it. But, yeah. So utilitarianism is great in some cases, but kind of hard to live.
Thank you, Matt, for a great talk. This is the first time I've been here. Where have you been all my life? I'll be back. Seriously, I mean, it's one thing to. My question is, I'll ask my question. It's rather simple and mundane, but yeah, it's one thing to. I really enjoy reading the Vonnegut's and the Hitchens and the Dawkins and watching the debates on, you know, with Sam Harris debating George Peterson. That's great. But to be around people physically is it's a whole different thing, you know, and so this is great, you know. And, my question is very simple. You had mentioned, and it just flew by and I missed it, you had mentioned a TV series on humanism. So what could you just tell me? Yeah,
it's not on. It's called The Good Place. It's the guy who did the guy who created it did Parks and Rec and The Office. It's Michael Schur. It's starring Kristen Bell and Ted Danson. Basically, it's an amazing show. They actually have an entire episode dedicated to the trolley problem, where they actually put the guy on a trolley and like make him make choices, and it's horrifying and violent, but it's like you actually see what it would be like, and so they but they do a lot of different kind of moral philosophy topics, and they, you know, I mean, and basically throughout history, like movies and fiction have used these thought experiments to write stories around, and that show is one of the best on TV because it does a really good job with that. But yeah, I think they're on Hulu right now. Netflix, yeah. The first two are on Netflix. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Thank you for a great talk, and I would love to know if you have some of your thoughts in some published form, but talk about that later. One of the practical things I run into in dealing with some of the ideas you have, which are basically stem, as you suggest, from the Enlightenment period. How do you deal with this when you're talking with our present-day so-called conservatives and trying to convince them that theirs is not the best approach to treating human beings? Their philosophy is, well, under the Constitution we have the right to make as much money as we want. We feel we're therefore entitled to keep all of it, which means they don't want to pay much in the way of taxes. And the fact that we happen to accumulate enough wealth to control power in the country and turn this country into a plutocracy doesn't seem to disturb them. How do you counter that in dealing with these people? I find myself that the ideology of conservatism is based on greed and racism. And somebody who says, well, I'm really conservative, immediately puts me on the alert that I'm talking about somebody who's not particularly rational. So the thing is, how on a practical level do you confront these people if you're going to have any realistic chance of changing their minds?
I think that the problem is, I don't see a world in which I forget who said it. I can just do the BS internet thing and say it was Mark Twain. But it was something where someone said, it's really hard to get someone to change their mind when their paycheck depends on them not changing their mind. That's paraphrasing it, and I forget who said it. I think that in the case of someone like Donald Trump or any of the people around him, the Koch brothers, probably the biggest, have done the most damage for stuff like climate change. They know the truth, they don't care. That was a Noam Chomsky thing. He said the idea that telling truth to power is somehow changes power's mind. Power knows the truth and it doesn't care about the truth. So in that case, your only real option isn't to try and change minds, it's to take their power away. I think that, I have conservative family members and they're all good people and they're all smart people, but when it comes to certain things, they hit walls where they just can't hear it. And I think that that's, for a lot of people with stuff like religion too, rejecting religion would mean kind of rejecting a whole lot of stuff in your life that you're not willing to reject yet. And I know a lot of people who are humanists have gone through that process where they left a religion and it isn't a totally easy thing to do. So I think the problem isn't trying to convince them, it's in realizing that you can't really you can't go up against irrationality with rationality because it just won't work. Donald Trump isn't interested in climate change because he's got his power, he's got his money, and he's got his friends that want certain things that are against it. And so there's no thing that you can say to him to change his mind or that you can say to most of these very rich people. So if they have power, I'd just say take it away rather than try and talk reason to them.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. At a recent talk you gave at Brookdale, you talked a little bit about how supporting human rights is overwhelming for so many people because there are just so many crises all over the world. And you suggested that there might be things that people can do more locally. Mm-hmm. Could you just address that a little for this group?
Yeah, so there's in the field, it's called compassion fatigue. And the idea is that basically, if you've ever muted the TV after watching the Sarah McLachlan ASPCA commercial, because it's just, watching puppies shudder is not too much for you, that's not the response they're trying to get, but a lot of different movements will try and get you to feel compassion for people in other groups, and your compassion is finite and the world's suffering is infinite, and so it's really hard to deal with that. Locally, I do think there is a lot of, a lot that we can do. It's very easy. I think that anything that basically elevates human dignity is doing the right work. For me, my part-time job now is I work at the library in town, which is amazing. They offer a place for a lot of people who are homeless or who are in really rough situations. It's just a place they can go and be all day, and they can just sit and read, and they can be near, they have free access to the computers, and it does programs for kids who, that type of thing is really small and it doesn't seem huge, but a library makes a huge difference, and the Red Bank Library is an amazing library. Which we have our former director over here. But you have like spaces like that where you can do a lot of good for people. I know that like Kate, for example, the Environmental Commission just put in like these little water bottle refilling stations around town, which are fantastic because that means we're putting less plastic into our rivers and into our oceans. It's a really small thing. It's not going to save the world, but if every town did it, it could make the world a much better place. And so if, when people feel despair, I think it's because they're looking at the whole situation of the world and not thinking of what you can do locally. And, as far as getting involved locally, I've found that it's as easy as walking into rooms like this one and just talking to people, and they'll say like, oh, we're doing this thing over here, or do you know about this? Have you heard of the Red Bank Humanists? Have you heard of HABCOR? Have you heard of Lunch Break? Have you heard, and there's dozens of little groups in town. There's the Citizens for a Diverse and Open Society right here. Yeah, there are all these groups that do this incredible work, and you don't really know about them until you actually get out and are around the people in town who are already doing these things, and they can connect you with others. So.
And let me just put in a pitch as we're coming down. We'll take a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. But in terms of doing good locally, we do have this year-end campaign, which is largely devoted to our charitable involvement with both local and national groups. The Red Bank Library is one of the organizations that we donate to, and by donating to our year-end campaign, you can help the Red Bank Library, you can help HABCOR, you can help the Secular Student Alliance nationally, you can help Camp Quest, which is a short-term sleepaway camp for bringing young minds to humanism. And you can do all these things with the Red Bank Humanist label by giving to our organization. So that's one way you can make that difference locally. Any last questions? We have time for a couple more. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm just wondering, since it looks like from your bio you've done a lot about like refugee crises, and certainly that's where human dignity is probably at its lowest ebb. And I think it sort of has created a lot of the right-wing or movements in Europe and Trump and all this stuff, because I think it sort of impacts people. People think it impacts their local community. So how do you fix that? How do you make people see broader than their own little self-interested community and stop all the fear and...
That one's really hard. The organization I worked for was the American Immigration Council. Pretty much everything negative you hear about immigrants is wrong. They commit crimes at lower rates than Americans of similar income levels. They add a ton to the economy. Whenever you see something talking about how immigrants are costing the country this much, that is basically just looking at the expenses. It's not looking at what we get from taxes and from working in the community. It's a really dishonest way of doing things, and it's a basically bald-faced racist way of talking about immigrants. I do think that there is an issue when it comes to immigration where it's not just about immigration. I think that humans by their nature are fairly open to feeling nasty towards outside groups, as they might think, and I think that people who are hurting economically are very prone to hearing those messages. So, you know, it's the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you basically don't have a lot of the things that you basically need, you're going to be much more willing to you know, hold these racist views towards immigrants. And so one of the things we came up against is, like, there were people who, you know, this was 2013 when we tried to pass immigration reform, and people who hated immigrants were actually struggling in their lives. This was right after the recession, it was in the middle of it actually, and it was, you know, there were a lot of people who were going through very difficult things, and for them it's easy to be told by someone, well, it's the immigrants that came in and took all these things, because it's convenient for powerful people to say that, because it's actually the powerful people that kind of took those things. And so I don't think that, you know, immigration reform is essential, but it has to be a part of a larger movement. It actually isn't just throwing aside, because I know good people who hold racist views. Like, I know them, the way they deal with me, and they're kind and they're decent and they'll take care of people around them, but then they'll say things and it's like, ah. Oh. So I think that just kind of discarding them as racists doesn't really take into account the reality of their lives and the fact that they're being fed a very easy message to digest, which is that it's not your fault, it's these people's fault. We should kick them out, we should put them in prison camps or gas them at the border. Like, you know, that type of thing doesn't outrage a lot of people because they've been convinced that that's the source of their hardship. And so you can't fight it just by telling them that it's wrong, because they'll think that you're funded by George Soros. Actually, the American Immigration Council was funded by George Soros, but you know, so but you know, you can't just tell people that they're wrong. There has to be an actual material change in their lives to fix a lot of these things. So.
If I could just speak to that for a moment, what I've noticed looking at the polling data, demographic data, and various things, it seems like the people who are most anti-immigrant are the people who don't interact with a lot of immigrants. There's a lot of anti-immigrant feeling in very rural areas that don't, you know, it's their unawareness of the common humanity of these other people. I think the best way to confront that is to allow immigrant stories to, you know, current immigrant stories, not the old Ellis Island stories, the current immigrant stories to become more prominent in the media, in culture, and to expose people who have negative views to an alternative perspective. I think that's really the only way that it works, and that's the way it has worked for other movements to eliminate bias.
Yeah, we've got a really incredible community in Red Bank too. There's a group called Awaken Community, which just started this past year with her in 2017 with a lot of the immigrant stuff, but we do have a large immigrant population, and so there are a lot of people that here that are active and are really cool people that we could, if we got to know them. I think
The west side, Sugar Avenue, the west side of Red Bank.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's what I live over
Rebuilt
there. Yeah, yeah, and that's, but yeah, if we get more people into rooms like this and kind of get them talking, then that is a solution.
So, hi, my name is Susan, and I guess I have to give a plug for the people that I'm concerned about, and that is people with disabilities. So, if you'd all like to know what you could do to help people with disabilities in the local community, it's to widen doors to a minimum of 32 inches, and if you do any reconstruction, think about making it accessible in terms of you being able to live there your whole life, if that's your choice. Because we still don't have a law that says homes need to be made accessible. Of course, not historic buildings either, but new businesses do. However, with the ADA passage for the Americans with Disabilities, there's no enforcement. So you'll see a lot of things going on that are not enforced. And if you want to enforce it, you have to be an individual who goes and signs a complaint. So that's what you can do for a lot of people in your neighborhood. Thank you.
I'm going to take one more question, and then we're going to wrap up.
Well, this isn't really a question, it's just a statement. I know I have compassion fatigue too, and I think I can't possibly address all the things. But then a long time ago, we found out that you really start small and you help people one at a time. And each person really is like a whole world. If you change one person's life, they would change other people's lives. And we used to have fresh air kids. And we changed the lives of kids from New York, Puerto Rican, African American kids went back and changed their lives and their families' lives. My son brought a boy from Haiti and educated him, and he has a whole life here now. He's writing a book and graduated from college. I mean, there's people in your neighborhood who need help. I live in a senior community. I could be helping people every minute. And if you just do that, that kind of spreads out to be the whole world. And then I don't have to concentrate on the people in Myanmar and the Rohingyas and the people that are starving in Yemen. I can just help the people nearby. That's my solution to taking care of.
And just a thing I can add a bit to that is, so I no longer do, I did work for an online publication, and when you're working in that environment, clicks are the most important thing, and the easiest way to get clicks is through the negativity bias and through outrage. And so like there are a lot of, it is very easy for a lot of publications to slip into this kind of, things are all falling apart, the world's ending, because people click on that because people just naturally gravitate towards negative news. So I think that if you spend a lot of your day on social media or on Twitter, Facebook, or anywhere, and you're just getting that stuff all the time, then you can't really help but get really despairing about the state of the world. Whereas I've found, like, just coming out in Red Bank, I've found a lot more going on and a lot more hope for the future, even if it still could be very bad, but there's still, we could build something nice here. So, yeah.
I found that myself too, that I wasn't going to, I've been so negative since, that certain date, 11/9. And I was really going downhill, and I thought, well, instead of looking at the negative things, I'm going to look at all the positive around me. And it's all over the place. I was so surprised. Every time I look, somebody's doing something good for somebody. So it really far outweighs the negative.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone again for coming up today. And you already did my applause. I wanted wanted to thank Matt for having such a good presentation.